Hello and welcome to Real Men Feel. I'm your host, author, coach, and healer, Andy Grant. You can learn more about me by visiting theandygrant.com. Real Men Feel reminds men that they are human beings and have the right to experience and express all of their emotions. We have conversations that most men are not having, but that all men can benefit from. My guest today is Michael Taylor. Coach Michael Taylor is known as the Irrepressible Optimist with a passion for the impossible. He is an entrepreneur, author of 16 books, a motivational speaker, a certified life coach, and a podcaster who has dedicated his life to empowering men and women to create extraordinary lives. Michael and I discuss spirituality, religion, and Jesus as a life coach. Michael shares some powerful stories on manifesting, how God is like Coke, and what he sees as the greatest challenge on the planet. Let's do it. Hello, Michael, and welcome to Real Men Feel.
I am excited to be here, man. It's been a minute. So we've been communicating on Facebook for a couple of years, and wow, here we are. So glad to be here.
Yeah. You're one of those interesting Facebook friends that have been friends so long, see your posts, often commenting and sharing, going back and forth, yet we had not talked until very recently. So yeah, I'm excited for this too. So Michael, I know you're an entrepreneur, a motivational speaker, a podcast host, radio, TV host. Is it 15 books you've written?
16, actually.
16 now. And you're also known as the Irrepressible Optimist with a passion for the impossible. So my first question is, have you always been such an irrepressible optimist?
You know, interestingly enough, the answer is yes. And if there's such a thing as a resilient gene, I got it from my mom. Because, I was born in inner city projects of Corpus Christi, Texas, to a single mom with 6 kids back in the 60s. And we were basically the poster children for poverty. But my mom always instilled in me this sense of optimism. I never remember a time hearing her bitch or complain about anything. She just always found a way to make things happen. And I think she kind of passed it on to me. So I've always been pretty optimistic.
Talking about that powerful impact of your mother, was there any male impact in your childhood?
None at all, actually.
None.
I had a grandfather that dropped a few nuggets of wisdom, but for the most part, very few male influences. And I think that's one of the reasons why I gravitated towards men's work, because I really longed for that. I didn't have a relationship with my dad. And I know that I had friends that had relationships with their dad, and I kind of envied them a little bit. And I guess because of that, I actually became a really good dad. I love being a dad. I have 3 grown kids now. But the male influence for me early was just people I saw on television.
In hindsight, perhaps you didn't know in the time, but were those televised male role models, for lack of a better word, were they a positive influence on you or a negative?
Positive, extremely positive. Interestingly enough, I remember in the 70s, the blaxploitation films where, black men were pimps and hustlers, and you saw all these negative stereotypes in mainstream media. I never gravitated towards any of those. I remember the first person that really I resonated with as a kid was Martin Luther King. Because I remember growing up, once again in the 60s, and seeing all the racial strife and having actually in elementary school, we had racial riots, believe it or not, in elementary school. And I remember seeing this black guy talking about peace, and I just thought, despite all the fighting and the racial division we had, here's this guy trying to bring people together. And I just was always moved by Martin Luther King.
And did you ever get a chance to see him live?
No, did not.
Okay.
Did not.
And so you mentioned that longing for men's work, longing for a relationship with your dad. Was it only as you saw like friends or neighbors with their fathers? Is it that comparison that made you realize you were missing something?
No. And here's a unique story. When I was probably 10 years old, I remember my dad spanked me for something. And we had a house that was up on cinder blocks. And I could literally crawl under the house, and underneath the steps, I had this little fun place where I'd go and I'd play with my little Hot Wheel cars. And that was my safe space, right? And I remember my dad spanking me, and I was under the house, underneath the steps. And I remember this exact thought. when I grow up and have kids, I'm not going to treat my kids the way my dad treats me. I was probably 10 years old, but I remember that as though it were yesterday because I remember just sitting or just crying. And the problem was, or the issue was, he spanked me for something that I didn't deserve to be spanked for. And I just remember it was just so unfair. And again, I didn't have a relationship with him. And my dad was one of the stoic, typical males, never expressed emotion, never, hugged me and said, I love you or any of that kind of stuff. He was your typical, let's go home, work hard, drink beer and watch TV. That's about it. But again, there was just a part of me that intuitively knew that I was going to be a great dad. And I committed to that. And I remember after my divorce, the fear I had as a dad, not being with my kids, what I did was I started studying how to be a great dad. I read books. I went to seminars. I wanted to make sure that I didn't treat my kids the way my dad treated me. And so I can honestly say with no hesitation, I'm an excellent father.
Awesome. One of your many books, one that really caught my eye was the title is phenomenal. What if Jesus were a coach? So tell me a bit about how that came to you as an idea, how that particular book developed.
Well, but let's go back a little bit because I was I was brought up Baptist, and even as a kid, I just knew there was something wrong with what I was being taught. At a very early age, I was extremely skeptical about this whole religious thing. And my grandparents, who I was living with, were very, very religious people. But what I couldn't understand was they made me go to church, but they never went to church. And they had the statue of Jesus on the wall. They had the pictures of Jesus with the light emanating from his heart. And so this was a person they talked a lot about, but my grandmother was literally the grandmother from hell. She was a raging alcoholic who took out most of her anger and rage on me as a kid. And so the people that I was supposed to look up to and learn about God from were just not very nice people. And so I think that's where my whole skepticism about God started. Well, fast forward to, I grew up, I get married and go to church temporarily. And then I said, no, I don't really believe this stuff. But it wasn't until after my divorce that I decided to go back to church because number one, I was in a lot of pain and I was trying to figure out how to alleviate that pain. So I'm thinking, well, maybe it would help if I go to church. So I go to church and I do all the Baptist stuff. I repent of my sins. I confess with my mouth that Jesus is my Lord and Savior. I become saved. I become a Christian. The truth is, I didn't believe any of it. The only reason I was there is because I was in so much pain. I thought it would help. And so after probably 3 or 4 weeks, all of the questions that I had about God kept popping up. And I had a bunch of them that no one could answer. And there was one question in particular that really, it was like a splinter in my mind that I just couldn't get it out. And so one Sunday, I go to my minister and I said, look, can we meet after church? Because I got something I need to ask you. He said, sure. So we meet after church in his office. And I said, look, I need to ask you a question. And your answer to the question is going to determine whether or not I stay with your church. And he looked at me kind of puzzled. He goes, okay. And I said, all right, hypothetical situation. Let's imagine that there are two people born at the exact same moment. One is born in poverty, the other is born in wealth. Now, let's imagine that they go through life and the person that's born in poverty does all the bad things. The person born in wealth does all the good things. Now, just imagine that they both die at the exact same moment and they end up at the entrance to heaven. And there standing behind the podium with his book of life is God. So God calls up the guy born in poverty, flips to his book of life, kind of frowns and grimaces a little bit, goes, ooh, you did a lot of really bad things. But I'm a loving, forgiving God. And there's really only one question you have to answer. Did you and do you accept my son, Jesus Christ, as your Lord and Savior? God looks up at God apologetically. God, I repent of my sins. I accept your son, Jesus Christ, as my Lord and Savior. And God says, come on in. Next, he calls up the guy born in wealth, flips through his book of life. Big smile comes over his face. He says, wow, you did all the really good things. But there's only one question you have to answer. Did you and do you accept my son, Jesus Christ, as your Lord and Savior? God looks up at God and says, well, we got a small problem. I honestly can't do that because, first of all, I've never even believed you existed. And God says, well, I'm really sorry to hear that. And if you'll just go and take the elevator down, you get to spend an eternity in hell. So I looked at my minister point blank and I said, look, is that how your God works? And he didn't even blink. Absolutely. That's what the Bible teaches. That's what I believe. So I looked at him and I said, Pastor, no disrespect, but that is the most insane, irrational, illogical thing I have ever heard in my life. How can you believe such a thing? He said, that's what's in the Bible. That's what I believe. And I said, man, that just doesn't make sense to me. He said, son, you just need to study your Bible. I said, no, I don't. And it was in that moment, I became an atheist. In that moment, I walked away from the church and I went, that just doesn't make sense to me. So I held firmly put to that belief for about 4 years. And then I began my own journey and I went to try to find my truth. And actually, the way it started is I had begun investing in personal growth and development stuff, right? And so what I wanted to do was to prove to myself that God didn't exist. And so I started reading Dawkins' book, which was The God Delusion. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. You know, Dawkins is that world famous atheist guy or whatever. And I really liked I really loved the book, right? I realized, okay, so this kind of aligns with what I believe, right? But then I started asking myself some questions, and then I received what I'll call a miracle. I was watching television one day, and there was an interview. This guy was talking to this Buddhist monk. And as I listened to the interview, I really resonated with what this Buddhist monk said. And I went, wow, that's pretty interesting. Now, when I was a Baptist, you couldn't even think about another religion because they said that was a sin, right? You weren't supposed to do that. Well, as an atheist, hey, no problem. So I decided to go to a bookstore and I started learning about Buddhism. And for the first time, I kind of felt something spiritual. And I went, okay, so maybe there's more to this than I thought. And so what I did was I started going to all of the major religions. I went to a Muslim mosque. I went to a Jewish synagogue. I went to a Hindu temple. And I just started asking people what they believed and why. I started reading some of their texts. And I was like, wow, okay. And so after 2 or 3 years of my own search, I found my truth about God. And I said, basically every religion said the same thing. And the one thing they said, which to me is what's the common denominator of all of them, is that we have access to something greater than ourselves. You can call it God, you can call it what, but there is a higher power. Okay. And so I choose to call this higher power divine intelligence. That's just what works for me. And so I knew that, or once I made that connection and I really started digging deeper into spirituality, I just really connected with my truth. What's true for me? And so I decided, I want to share some of the lessons that I learned along this journey. And the one thing that really stood out for me, and one of the questions that I asked myself was, so after studying all the major religions, I said, for a while, I completely rejected Christianity because of my early experiences. And then I asked myself, what does this Jesus character have to do with all of this? And so I started researching Jesus's life, and I actually bought a Bible for the first time. And I skipped straight to the New Testament, started reading some of the New Testament. And actually, here's exactly what happened. It was probably 3:00 in the morning. And I was sitting at home, and something told me to go buy a Bible, right? It just so happened that I live right down the street from this 24-hour bookstore. So I get up at 3 or so in the morning. I walk to this bookstore. I go inside. I buy one of those, what do you call those new edition Bibles that's in plain English, because the King James Version I could never get it with all the way that, the way they were speaking. But anyway, so I buy one of these new edition Bibles and I go home and I just something just told me to go to what Jesus said, because I remember, in church, you read the Bible and everything that was in red, Jesus said. I don't know if you remember that. And I just remember, I said, I just want to figure out what he said. And I turned to Matthew for some reason. And as I started reading, the parts where Jesus spoke, it felt as if Jesus was sitting right next to me, talking to me, explaining to me what he meant. And it was so profound that I literally broke down in tears because I felt this love that I never felt in any church setting before. And that love came from what I was hearing from him in my heart. And so after that experience, I just had a different perception, if you will, of Jesus and religion and so forth. And I said, I want to share what I learned. And I said, what if you took all the religious dogma and doctrine out of religion and simply looked at Jesus as a life coach? What did he teach? And that's what the book is about. It's about removing the dogma and doctrine of organized religion and saying, look, put all that aside and just imagine that he's a life coach. And he's going to give you some tools to help you create an extraordinary life, because that's exactly why I think he showed up. And so I know that's a long answer to your question, but that's how the book came about.
So do you find that Jesus made a good coach?
Absolutely. He was, in my opinion, the greatest life coach that ever lived. If we learn to interpret what he said metaphysically, not literally, because it is my belief that every religion originates from the same source and leads to the same place. Okay. So with that being said, I believe, again, this is Michael Taylor's belief, that Jesus was the ultimate expression of God in human form. He came to teach us how to access the Christ within us. So a lot of people say Jesus Christ as if Christ was his last name. No, Jesus was the Christed one. He was the divine expression of God that divine intelligence used to let human beings know that it was there, right? So the way I see it is that the Christ, which is the Son of God, is the energy that the divine intelligence sent out into the universe when the universe was created. So for me, Jesus was the perfect coach, and Christianity is the process that we go through to become Christ-like. So if you, again, remove all the religious dogma and doctrine from it all, and just look at it as this, here's this guy that's going to coach you on being the best version of yourself. And the way you do that is to connect to something greater than yourself, which he called his Father. Okay. So he said in his own words, these things and even greater things you shall do also. I believe that's a literal statement.
Yeah.
Because what he meant was we had the same access to his Father that he did. Yeah. And if we just follow his teachings, we could do everything that he did. That's how I interpret.
Yeah, I'm going to say we've had surprisingly similar religious journeys. So I was not, my parents weren't following any religion. I was not raised with one. So as I looked around, saw people going to church and stuff, I was like, oh, I guess that makes me an atheist. And I remember like at 8 years old, I gave myself that term, not really knowing what it meant, but I'm like, well, I don't go somewhere on Sunday, so that must mean I'm an atheist. And finally in college, I was very interested, and I took a class on Islam. I took a class on world religions, and much like you did, each of them I looked at, wow, they have way more in common than not, and so much unifying things about going within, higher power, love really being the answer, the solution, the energy, the force, all of those things. So I love everything you're saying. Like Jesus never said, worship me, create a religion around me. He just said, you can be like me. I'm doing what you can do. You can do bigger and better, like you said. So yeah, so many I get misinterpreted words over centuries that just continue to go places and spread out. But yeah, it's amazing how many people praise Jesus literally and don't act as Jesus.
Exactly. By his own admission, Jesus said, I did not come to be served. I came to serve that which is greater than myself, which is his Father. So a lot of people don't understand Jesus wasn't a Christian.
Right.
Christianity was built off of his teachings, and the people
Mhm.
that follow him became Christians, but Jesus was not a Christian per se. But my point is, after going on this journey, right, finding my own truth, and I think that's the key. What happens is when we really go on that journey to find our truth and not just accept what was passed down to us, and when we authentically connect to that truth, nothing is impossible. So you mentioned, that my tagline says I'm an irrepressible optimist with a passion for the impossible. Well, see, a couple of things that Jesus said that I take literally. And one of the things he said was, whatever you ask in my name, you shall receive. Now, from my perspective, when I read that, what I hear is that if I set an intention, I have the power to manifest that intention. You familiar with Deepak Chopra?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So Deepak Chopra says something I love. He says, inherent in every intention and desire are the mechanics for its fulfillment. Put another way, you can't even have the idea without the capacity to manifest it. So if we accept the idea that Jesus was teaching us how to access this Father that he kept talking about, then that tells me that divine ideas is how God speaks to us. God gives us these divine ideas. And when we learn to trust and follow that divine idea to live our purpose, then we are doing God's work. That's kind of how I see it. And so, once again, I think Jesus laid the blueprint for what we would have to go through to get to the point to become Christ-like. And one of the metaphors I love in his story was the whole idea of death and resurrection. So, we think of Jesus on the cross for 3 days, coming back and all that. But to me, from my own experience, see, a part of me literally had to die. And some people would call that your ego self. So when I went through my divorce and all the negative stuff that I talked about, and I went on this personal growth journey, it was really about waking up to who I was born to be. And so before my divorce, I was a typical American guy. I had the house, the wife, the 2.5 kids, the vacations and all of that, but yet I was completely miserable. And it wasn't until I lost everything that I was resurrected to who I was born to be. And that's what I love about that story, because I think that story, once again, is just a metaphor for what we have to go through. Sometimes a part of us has to die. That ego self, that false self, the mask that we wear, all that stuff has to go away before we awaken to who we truly are.
Can you expand on some of the differences between being spiritual and being religious?
To me, God is like Coke. It's the real thing. Some people drink Coke out of a bottle. Some people drink it out of a can. Some people drink lots of it. Some people won't touch it. A religion is just a container. Each container holds the divine thirst quencher, which is God. So you can drink from a Muslim container. You can drink from a Hindu container, but those are just the containers that they all hold the same thing. So religious people get caught up into the container. I'm a Muslim, but they don't drink what's in the container. Christians, unfortunately, in a lot of cases, especially some of the Christians we see in our society, they're so wrapped up in the container that they never drink it. They just carried it around saying, look, see my container, but they don't drink it. So when you drink it and you accept what it's going to give to you, which is the spiritual aspect of who you are, that's when you shift from being religious to spiritual, because it's no longer about something outside of you. It's about what's inside of you. It's about that divine intelligence that permeates your core. It is what drives your heartbeat. It's what keeps the planets aligned. It's what makes a bone heal. There's an intelligence in this universe. And to me, that's what I call divine intelligence. And so spiritual people make that connection to that intelligence, knowing that you don't have to have a label for it. You just have to develop an intimacy and connection to it. And when you do, once again, nothing is impossible.
But this also isn't just a blind faith. You had experiences. You had lived happenings. You had what I think you even used the term a miracle. So it's as if the divine intelligence had to prove to Michael that yes, this is a real thing, and yes, you can tap into it.
Oh, I got it. I have to share this story because this is really cool. Because one of the challenges I had with organized religion or religion in general was the fact that I needed proof. That's like, show me, don't just say God, prove to me, right? Well, while I was living out of my car, I lived out of my car for 2 years, okay? In the backseat of my car. So, Mike Dooley?
Yes.
The guy Notes Us from the Universe? Yeah. You remember Mike Dooley? Okay. So what's really fascinating about this story, and actually, let me share the story first and I'll tell you. So while living in the back seat of my car, I would go to the library and I started what I call my journey of transformation. I started reading self-help books and listening to audio programs. And I came across Mike Dooley's work. And Mike Dooley teaches thoughts become things. Okay. And so when I was first introduced to that concept, it really resonated for me. The very first time I read it, I went, that makes a lot of sense. Okay. So I'm living in the back of my car. I'm studying Mike Dooley. Well, another thing I learned from Mike Dooley was creating a vision board. And I'd never heard of a vision board before I met Mike Dooley. So while living in the back seat of my car, I bought some of those yellow sticky notes. And what I would do is I'd write on the yellow sticky note what I wanted to manifest, and I'd stick it on the back of the seat. And so one of the things I want to manifest was a job, because again, I had been out of work for a long time. So I stuck it on the back of the seat. I wanted to manifest a job. Well, the next day I'm reading a newspaper and I see this advertisement for laborers. And there's a place called the Labor Hall. And the Labor Hall is where drug addicts, ex-convicts, and homeless people go to find work. And the way it works is you walk in and there's a bunch of benches and you sit down. There's a guy up front. He randomly picks people to sit them on these odd jobs. Okay. So again, I wrote on a sticky note, I wanted to manifest a job. So I go to the Labor Hall. I sit on the bench. I sit on the bench for maybe 6 hours. I never get picked. I go home that night in the backseat of my car. And I'm like, okay, universe, this ain't working. All right, tomorrow we're going to manifest a job. Put another sticky note. The next day I go to the Labor Hall. I sit down. I'm there for maybe 8 hours. Don't get picked. Go back home that night, backseat of my car. All right, universe, this shit ain't working. This manifestation stuff, maybe, I don't know. And so I said a little prayer, kind of. And I said, look, I'm willing to do anything, but I need proof that this stuff works, because I want to believe it. I want to believe that it works, right? And so the next day I go to the Labor Hall. And when I said that prayer, I basically said, look, I'm willing to do anything. Just help me manifest a job. So the next day I go to the Labor Hall and I'm sitting on the bench and the guy up front asked if anyone has a car. I raise my hand. I'm the only person with the car. He calls me up to the front. He says, do you have gas? I said, well, how much do I need? He says, well, it's about 15 miles away. I said, ooh, it would be close. He said, I'll tell you what, I'm going to give you $10. And when you come back and complete your day, cash your check, give me my $10 back. Fair enough. That's cool. I'm driving down the freeway and I am so excited. I'm like, holy crap, this thoughts become things, stuff works. I manifested a job and I was so excited. But all of a sudden, my excitement turned to dread. As I pull in, it's one of those companies that manufactures portable toilets. I go in, the guy that I'm working for is a real jerk. I mean, he's a real knucklehead. He gives me a vacuum. He gives me some gloves. He gives me some disinfectant. He said, your job is to clean those toilets. My first thought was, no freaking way. And I went, I'm I'm not doing this. But then I remember, oh, that got $10. I said, dang, I got to give the guys $10. I said, oh, okay, so let me try it. So I start cleaning the toilets. All of a sudden, it starts to rain. And actually, it wasn't rain. It was more like a torrential downpour. Rain was going sideways. The wind was blowing so hard. So I run inside and I said, look, can I wait until it slows down a little bit? He goes, no, get that raincoat, get your ass back out there. You need to clean those toilets right now. My first impulse was to smack him. But then I remembered my prayer from the night before. And I specifically said I was willing to do anything. And all of a sudden, my attitude shifted. All of a sudden, a big smile came over my face. I shifted to gratitude and I was like, thank you, universe. This is disgusting. I hate it, but I manifested a job. I said I would do anything, so I can't complain. I cleaned those toilets for 8 hours with a smile. Okay? So I go back, cash my check, get a guy $10 back, buy me a nice fat hamburger, which I hadn't had in a long time. And it was so another sticky note. All right, universe, we go back tomorrow. We're going to get another job. I walk into the labor hall and I don't even sit down. The guy sees me and he goes like this. I go to the front. He gives me a ticket. This time I go to this company where they're building this new high-rise building. My first thought was, at least I'm not cleaning toilets today. So I go and I meet the supervisor. He takes me to this electrician, and my job was to clean up after the electrician as a laborer. Well, the electrician that he partnered me with, he and I clicked immediately. We're talking about family and sports, and I mean, we just really connected. And then he asked me if I knew anything about electrical work, which I did. He says, really? He said, I tell you what, go over there and install these receptacles. So he wanted to see if I knew what I was doing. So I'll go over there and I install the receptacles and blah, blah, blah. So the entire day, rather than being a laborer, I'm actually his assistant, okay? At the end of the day, he takes me to his supervisor's office and he says, I need you to hire this guy full time to be my permanent assistant. I went from making $4.50 an hour to $15.50 an hour with a full-time job with benefits. Took me a few weeks to get back on my feet, got my own place, but that's how I was able to get back on my feet. Now, do you think that was an accident, how that occurred? No. It was divine synchronicity. It was trusting, knowing that this intelligence listened to my thoughts and actually is the core or the source of my thoughts that guided me to look in the newspaper, find the labor hall, go do the work. Despite the fact that I wanted to leave that job, remembering my commitment, which I said I was willing to do anything, and then it manifested such an awesome job.
Yeah. Awesome. I love those stories. Yeah, I know Mike Dooley well. I'm certified to teach his Playing the Matrix and Infinite Possibilities training. I think I did those programs like 10 years ago. But yeah, the first time I did vision boards, the first manifesting, thoughts become things, all from Mike and from Andy Dooley as well.
Next week, I'm actually one of the speakers at his Infinite Possibility conferences.
Oh, awesome. Where is it this time?
It's all online. It's all online.
Cool. I thought so.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Used to travel the world.
And Grant, here's another cool thing about it. While I was living in my car, one of the things I put on a sticky note was one day I would share a stage with Mike Dooley. That was 20 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's one of the coolest things about discovering that power of manifestation of thoughts becoming things is that, you get exactly what you say. So you really got to be more conscious and aware and choose the right things. And, thoughts become things. So choose the good ones, right? That's exactly his whole saying. Yeah.
Couple other things I'll share real quickly too. While I was in the backseat of my car, I wrote on a sticky note that one day I would become a best-selling author. I knew nothing about writing books. I knew nothing about publishing books. I just wrote a note. Intention, manifest, becoming a best-selling author. Fast forward 20 years. I've written 16 books, as I mentioned. I've had 3 bestsellers, and I've had 2 that's won national awards. Started off with just a thought, just an idea, right? And the last thing not the last thing, but another thing that I wrote while I was living out of my car, I wrote on a yellow sticky note, I would manifest my life partner. And I've been blissfully married for the past 23 years.
Beautiful. Awesome.
How cool is
Yeah.
that?
Very cool. So with all that you've experienced, all that you create and share, what's one thing that you wish more men knew?
I think the greatest challenge we have on the planet right now is to redefine manhood and masculinity. And my hope is that men will open their minds enough to recognize that the old paradigm of masculinity no longer works. It's no longer sustainable. So as men, we have to be willing to embrace this new paradigm of masculinity. And I define a paradigm as a rigid way of believing, thinking, and behaving. That to me is a paradigm. So
Mhm.
as men, we get caught in these rigid ways of believing, thinking, and behaving what it means to be a man. So we have to be willing to open our minds a little bit, say, you know what, maybe that's a different way of being a man. And so my hope is that men, and again, the optimist in me is really excited because when I started writing 25 years ago, there were very few men having these types of conversations. As a matter of fact, I got attacked and vilified because, especially as a Black guy, I'm talking about emotions and feelings. Like, wait a minute, you've been hanging around the white people too much, right? But again, my hope is for men to tune in to shows like this to recognize that there's better ways to be. We don't always have to do. There's better ways to be happy, to be joyful, to be grateful, to be empathetic. There's better ways to be, and we just have to open our hearts and minds to that truth.
Yeah. Yeah. To me, it's really simple. And I often ask guys, if whoever taught you what it means to be a man was a miserable bastard, why the hell would you want to model that? Yeah.
Exactly.
Men deserve joy. Men deserve to be happy. Men deserve to know their divinity, right?
Yeah.
Men are powerful creators. It's not that, I don't believe there's toxic masculinity. I believe there's misguided masculinity. And what the world needs is less paradigm, more flexible masculinity, and more men in their power. And
and so here's my take on this whole toxic masculinity thing. As you just mentioned, there's no such thing. People confuse toxic behaviors with masculinity. Toxic behaviors are not toxic masculinity. The reason this man is acting out in a toxic way is because he's disconnected from his authentic masculinity. Because if he were connected to his heart, connected to his authentic, he would never act out in toxic ways. So again, in my experience, there's no such thing as toxic masculinity. That's just how I see it.
Yeah, no, couldn't agree more. With all you've done, what stands out top of mind for what you're most proud of?
Not falling victim to victimhood.
Right.
It could have been easy for me to say, well, society is not going to allow me to do such and such because I'm Black, because I don't have a college degree, because I don't have this background. I didn't fall victim to any of that. And the fact that I learned to listen to and trust my own heart, trust my own intuition, trust my own knowing that despite not having all those credentials, I had a lot to say. And so I remember when I first started writing books, I definitely dealt with that imposter syndrome, like, who am I to write a book, that kind of stuff. But now I'm extremely proud of the fact that, number one, I listened to my own heart. I developed that intimacy and connection to divine intelligence, which guides everything that I do. And I'm committed to making the world a better place. And I'm really proud of that.
Yeah, you've lived quite a life, and let me rephrase that. You're still living quite a life, and a lot more to create and share. So, Michael, tell me what's the best way for people to find out more about what you're up to and all the various things that you are up to?
Well, first of all, since we're focusing on men, which I think it's really important, if they'll log on to a new conversationwithmen.com, and they can get this free ebook that is called The 5 Illusions of Manhood. And it is these 5 illusions that I believe drives most negative male behavior. It's a powerful document that's a part of a book that I wrote of the same title called A New Conversation with Men. But they can log onto the website, get the free book, and jump into the 5 illusions of manhood. It will open your eyes and change your mind about what it means to be a man.
Awesome. Well, that is what we are all about. And I'm glad you're doing it. Glad I'm doing it. Glad everyone listening, finding us is doing it, willing to do it at least. So again, thanks, Michael, for joining us today. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Wherever you're finding Real Men Feel, please share, like, comment, share this episode with someone that would be benefited from it. You can join the Real Men Feel private Facebook group by visiting realmenfeel.org/group. You can always reach out to me at realmenfeel@gmail.com. And until next time, be good to yourself.